The hole and corner fashion in which the convict Mutter was condemned to death this morning is most repugnant to public feelings, and no time should be lost in instituting an inquiry. Sometimes a death sentence is just the start of the story. Back when Australia had capital punishment, pretty much anything could happen at the gallows. In this episode, we are going to hear about 6 times death sentences were botched. There are stories of pardons that came too late, equipment malfunctions, and one condemned man who got a good punch-up in while he was standing on the gallows. Welcome to Rat Bags and Roustabouts, the place where we hear those extraordinary stories of ordinary people who never made it to the history books. I'm your host, Marion Langford. So, in previous episodes, we've focused on just one story, but today we'll be mixing things up a bit and going through a few shorter ones, looking at some of the disasters and debacles that have taken place as prisoners faced that most awful sentence of the law, execution. Look, some had done some pretty nasty things to find themselves at the gallows, others certainly hadn't, but back in the 1800s in the Australian colonies, capital punishment was a fact of life. Now, as usual, there will be an extra little nugget related to today's episode for you all to read on the website, ratbagsandroustabouts.com. While you're there, you can read the show notes from this episode, which includes handy things like links to the key pieces of research I've used. You can also access all the past episodes. You can find a bit more out about me if you like, and you can also fill out the contact form if you have your own amazing family history story to share. And of course, if you'd like, you can head over to the Ratbags Instagram page and follow along there. Anyway, let's get into today's episode. Of course, if you hadn't quite cottoned on yet, this episode is all about executions that were botched or ballsed up. So that means we'll be talking about death and dead bodies and death by hanging, since that was the preferred method in colonial New South Wales. So if you'd rather not hear any of that, maybe listen to a different episode instead. These days, Australia is obviously very proud of the fact that it doesn't use the death penalty, but that clearly wasn't always the case. And it might surprise you how recently it was that capital punishment in the various states was actually abolished. Queensland was the first state to formally ditch the death penalty, more than a century ago in 1922. Tassie was the next in 1968, then the Commonwealth abolished it in 1973. Now, the Commonwealth hadn't actually executed anyone, but that law also covered the ACT and Northern Territory. ACT also hadn't had any executions, but the NT did. They executed just 9 people between 1893 and 1952. Then in 1975, Victoria did away with executions. South Australia joined the gang in 1976, and those Western Australians followed suit in 1984. Naturally, New South Wales had to make things difficult and abolish the death penalty for murder in 1955, but then 30 years later, in 1985, it abolished executions for all crimes. And out of interest, as recently as 2010, legislation was passed preventing any state or territory reinstating capital punishment. But those dates are just for when the law changed. The last actual execution in Australia took place in 1967 in Victoria with a bloke called Ronald Ryan, who was found guilty of killing a prison warden during an escape. And at that time, there were lots of protests over the death sentence, and his supporters observed a 3-minute silence when he was executed. After that, people were still sentenced to death, but in the end, all of those were commuted to life imprisonment. That was not always the case, though, which we will hear about as we get into today's episode. And I guess we should start with the beginning, because the British didn't take long to pass death sentences on some of those first fleeters in the very early days of the settlement. But Arthur Phillip kind of put the cart before the horse, because there was just one problem with that. They didn't yet have a hangman. Now, this story you might have heard a bit of before. It was February 1788. The First Fleet had only been in Port Jackson a few weeks, and people were hungry. They'd just spent a really long time on a boat. It was an arduous journey, and now that they'd arrived in New South Wales, there wasn't a lot of food in the government stores. Everyone was surviving under rations, and they had been warned that anyone who was caught stealing from the stores would be handed the most severe of punishments, death. Clearly, this was meant as a disincentive. Arthur Phillip wasn't really set up for executing prisoners just yet. But then, of course, a group of convicts decide they're hungry enough to risk it anyway. Thomas Barrett, Henry Lovell, Joseph Hall and John Ryan were accused of plotting to rob the government stores. Phillip held a trial on February 27, and at around 1 p.m, they were all found guilty. The first 3 were sentenced to death. Ryan was sentenced to 300 lashes, and the executions were to be carried out before sunset that very day. They picked out a tree. That was the easy bit. For those Sydney-siders listening, it was near the corner of the present-day Essex and Harrington streets in the Rocks. But they then had trouble finding anyone willing to become the colony's first hangman. This seemed to come as a bit of a shock to those in charge that nobody was keen to act as executioner. In the end, they had to bully poor old Ryan, the youngest of the 4, to execute his mates. The story goes that they actually held a gun on him and threatened to shoot him if he didn't do it. I mean, you can see the irony there, right? They're willing to kill him if he doesn't kill his mates. I feel like they could have just cut out the middleman there. Anyway, they all turn up to this big old gum tree with a suitable branch, and they're told Barrett will be the only one executed, with Lovell and Hall to get a 24-hour reprieve before joining him in eternity the following day. Barrett gets up there and Ryan is forced to do the deed. The next day, though, it starts to rain. A lot. Those Brits were used to rain, but not rain like this. It absolutely pissed it down. The executions were postponed again, and naturally, in the meantime, pleas for mercy were taken to Phillip. Surely everyone had got the message from Barrett's execution, right? There was no need to kill the other blokes. It worked. The rain saved their lives. But it was still left with the problem of finding a proper hangman. And in the meantime, more convicts had been caught trying to steal from the government stores. So maybe Barrett's execution hadn't really driven the message home, come to think of it, and Ryan was not keen to do the job again. So, being practical, Phillip decided to give one of the next group of convicts who'd been caught, a fellow called James Freeman, a conditional pardon if he agreed to take on the role in an official capacity. But he didn't produce this offer until Freeman was literally under the tree moments from death. This is what John White, the chief medical officer, wrote about it. While under the ladder with the rope about his neck, he was offered a free pardon as condition of performing the duty of the common executioner as long as he remained in this country, which, after some little pause, he reluctantly accepted. The other 3 were then reprieved from dying that day to give the new bloke in the job some time for orientation. And that is how the British settlement got its first official hangman. All right, let's fast forward 2 years now to August 1790. A fellow called Hugh Lowe was arrested for stealing a sheep. We're still in the early days of the British settlement and food is still pretty important, so stealing a sheep is a serious crime. Lowe pleaded not guilty, but he didn't offer a compelling defence, so was found guilty at his trial and sentenced to death. Now, When Lowe had come out to New South Wales, he'd been put on a ship called the Guardian in 1789. It was a ship that was not so much a convict ship, but it was really bringing a lot of things out to the colony that Governor Phillip had forgotten. You know how it is. You go away and the second you land, you think, bugger it, I forgot such and such. Anyway, the Guardian became kind of the Titanic of the Southern Hemisphere. All right, that's a bit of a stretch, but it did hit an iceberg on December 23rd. There was a massive gash in the hull and water was coming in fast. They did what they could to pump and come up with some kind of temporary solution, but 2 days later, by the night of Christmas Day, there was over 2 metres of water in the hold and the ship was starting to roll violently. That's when they decided to throw overboard all the precious stock. Stores, guns and livestock were thrown overboard. There were 7 horses, 16 cows, 2 bulls, some sheep, goats, 2 deer, all hurled into the ocean, the poor things. Not that it made much difference. By the next morning, the sails had been torn away in a gale. The decision was made to ready the boats and abandon ship. There wasn't enough room in all the boats for everybody though. 259 people got into the boats and 62 were left on board. The captain, Edward Rieu, gallantly said he would stay with his ship and do what he could to salvage it. He wrote a letter, though, to send with the crew and convicts who were leaving. In it he said, "If any part of the officers or crew of the Guardian should ever survive to get home, I have only to say their conduct after the fatal stroke against an island of ice was admirable and wonderful in everything that related to their duties, considered either as private men or on His Majesty's service." There was now almost 5 metres of water in the bottom of the ship, but Rieu pulled a few miracles out of thin air and sailed it, limping by now, little more than a raft, into the Cape of Good Hope. And of the boats that left the ship, only 1 was picked up containing 10 people. The rest were never heard from again. So we come back to Hugh Lowe. He had performed gallantly during the disaster of the Guardian, and while on trial for sheep stealing, this was mentioned in his defence. But it didn't fly with the court, and he was executed all the same. A year later, though, in November 1791, a letter arrives in Port Jackson from none other but the King himself. In it, he gave his royal pardon to all the convicts who'd been aboard the Guardian, who'd helped to save the lives of people amid the tragedy. But it was too late for poor old Hugh, who was obviously already dead by then. And now we come to November 1796 and Francis Morgan. Morgan had been convicted in Dublin in 1791. It's unclear what it was for. I found one thing saying he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life, but that can't be right because the actual transportation records list his sentence as only 7 years. Either way, he arrived in Port Jackson in 1793 on convict ship the Sugarcane. We hear nothing much of him until 3 years later, when he began swiping stuff from the government stores. I know, it's the same old story, but that was not quite what got him executed. There were a few of them thieving from the government stores, and one night Morgan is there stealing some rum. Yet again here we have some conflicting reports. One said it was a gallon, another said it was just half a pint. Either way, another man, Simon Raven, happened to come in and catch him red-handed. Morgan panicked and bashed Raven over the head, killing him. Not the best move on Morgan's part. He was charged with murder and found guilty. And it seemed hanging him wasn't enough for the judge advocate. He thought he'd make an example out of him. So his sentence read that Francis Morgan should be hung in chains upon the small island which is situated in the middle of the harbour. For people who know Sydney, that island these days is known as Fort Denison. But the fortified island as it is now, complete with brick walls and cannon, looks very different to what it did in those days, when it was essentially just a bit of a hill sticking out of the shark-infested Sydney Harbour. The name for the island given by the Eora people was Matawanye, and when the British came they started calling it Rock Island. But soon it became used as a form of punishment. Convicts would be plonked on it for a week with only bread and water as some kind of solitary confinement punishment. Because of that, the convicts christened it Pinchgut Island. So Morgan was whisked off to Pinchgut to meet his fate. Now, his fate involved gibbeting. Usually when someone was hanged, the body was left for an hour before being taken down. But with gibbeting, the body is left hanging in chains as a warning to others. But before we get to that, Morgan and a small group were first taken out to the island where the condemned man looks back at Sydney Cove and the fledgling settlement there. These days, Sydney is known for being one of the most beautiful cities in the world. People pay millions to have a harbour view. Back then, though it looked very different, it was still stunning. So it was that when Morgan was asked if he had any last words, he bowed to the governor and said, "I have to thank Your Excellency for giving me the opportunity of dying among the most beautiful scenery in the world." Morgan's judgment simply said he would be hung on a gibbet in a prominent position until such time as His Excellency pleases. And His Excellency pleased for poor old Morgan's body to hang there for a very long time, 4 years to be precise. By the end it wasn't much more than a skeleton. In fact, our old mate Dickie White from a couple of episodes ago, check it out, would have seen Morgan hanging there when he arrived in 1799. But the gibbeting of Morgan didn't really fulfil the governor's goal. By then, Gallows' humour had set in and the poor dead man was more of a joke to the convicts than anything else. In 1828, the Australian newspaper, that's not the one we have these days, just to be clear, reported the following in its list of cases in front of the criminal court: George Kildray, John Donohoe and William Smith for highway robbery. Death. John Donohoe was none other than Jack Donahue, who has entered Aussie folklore now as the wild colonial boy. William Smith, on the other hand, doesn't feature in any poems or stories or songs, and that's because after that sentence of death was handed down, Jack Donahue made a daring escape on the road between the court and the jail. So, while he was off continuing his criminal career, the gallows were being prepared for Smith and Kildray, who is also known as Kilroy, as well as another fellow, William Johnson, who was convicted of murder. Everything went as planned at first. They each had a church minister to attend to them. They looked downcast. They said their final prayers. There was a group of people gathered to watch. It was mid-morning. The men were all standing in place and finally the signal was given. The pin was pulled and the platform under the men gave way. The crowd gasped. Kilroy and Johnson's execution had gone as planned, but Smith was lying on the ground, unhurt and still very much alive. His rope, clearly a little worn, had snapped in half. And that's when it began to dawn on everyone of the pickle they were in. Because it was customary for the executed men's body to hang for that requisite time of an hour, they couldn't just get a new rope and reset the gallows and try again. No, Smith would have to wait. The fall hasn't injured him in any physical way and they get him up, get the rope off him. They have to stand him up on one of the waiting coffins to do this, mind you. Meanwhile, Smith is not happy at all. One of the reverends is trying desperately to console him, to get him ready again to face the gallows a second time, but Smith isn't listening. I mean, how would you feel? You were all prepared for the end, then it didn't happen, but you know you still have to go through it a second time? The sheriff and another of the churchmen race off to Government House. They tell the governor, Ralph Darling, what's happened and beg him for mercy to let Smith off considering the situation. I mean, this could have turned into a positive for the poor bloke, and that certainly happened plenty of other times. but Darling was not inclined to grant clemency. To be fair, he had some good reasons for that. Smith had only been in New South Wales around 6 or 7 months, and in that time he'd managed to commit 3 highway robberies, one of them with extreme violence. So the sheriff and the reverend get back to the gallows, and they relay the governor's decision. Smith takes it pretty well considering, and by now the other 2 have been hanging for the allotted hour, so they speedily get them down, reset the platform, and dispatch poor old William Smith. Again. There is then a very proper article in the newspaper condemning the choice of rope and suggesting something better be used from then on. Smith did a much better job of keeping his composure on the gallows than the next bloke I'm going to tell you about. 2 years later, in the Hawkesbury region north of Sydney, in August 1830, John Tiernan went out with a bit of a bang when he was executed. He was only 17, but he'd gotten up to a whole load of things that the authorities weren't too happy about. A few months previous, he'd been dealt 75 lashes for assault of another convict. Since then, he had absconded from his iron gang, that's just another name for a chain gang, and then he'd racked up a bunch of charges including break and enter, theft, highway robbery and horse theft. But it was really the highway robbery that saw him get the sentence of death. While he was being held awaiting his execution, he did what he could to upset his jailers. A report in The Australian said he amused himself cutting forms of coffins, a man suspended by the neck and other quaint devices. He was also found with a file hidden on his person, presumably to attempt an escape. The whole time he's acting like he isn't really going to die in a few days' time. But at some point, it finally dawns on him that this is for real. He cries with his jailers, he cries with his mother, he cries with his sisters. He asks if his leg irons can be removed so that he will be able to walk firmly up to the gallows. The morning comes. He walks quickly with purpose to the scene of his execution. The clergyman helps him with his prayers and he climbs up to the platform. And that's when everything kind of comes unstuck. Tiernan is shuffling a bit on the platform of the gallows and then out of nowhere he elbows the hangman in the chest, then kicks him off the platform, which is 12 feet high, about 3.5 metres. Tiernan then jumps on top of him and begins kicking him as the poor man lays hurt on the ground. Eventually, the hangman manages to get away and Tiernan is grabbed. The hangman is actually pretty badly hurt. He can barely stand at this point and is covered in bruises. He has one particularly nasty one on his chest where Tiernan elbowed him. Meanwhile, it's Tiernan who is the one complaining. He's saying he dislocated his ankle. He's making a big show of rubbing it to try to garner some sympathy from the horrified onlookers. The Reverend starts to give the condemned man a stern talking to, while Tiernan asks for a drink of wine. And now they still have to go through the whole thing again. Frankly, it's something the hangman is not too pleased about. This time up on the platform, the hangman holds onto a rope so that he can't be pushed off again. Some other bright spark of a clergyman suggests that Tiernan and the hangman have a kiss to show that there's no hard feelings. Well, that goes down like a lead balloon. But they do manage to shake hands before the noose is put back in place, and Tiernan then does everything he can to prolong things. He asks to address the crowd, then he checks the rope, then he asks to have the noose inspected, then he asks to speak to the Reverend, then he wants to talk to the sheriff. Finally, Tiernan has no one else to talk to, and it's time. But remember when he was fiddling with the rope, wanting it checked? Well, it seems he inadvertently moved it slightly. So when the platform is finally dropped, the fall doesn't break his neck immediately, which is really what you want for a fast death. No, this is not an easy death at all. Afterwards, the hangman swears he almost died from the fall, and I reckon he probably had a good stiff drink. For our final execution fail, we're going forward a bit in time to when public executions were a thing of the past. Instead, they were done inside prisons with just the press there to represent the people. Well, usually. It was in June 1879 up in Townsville, Queensland, when Joseph Mutter was sentenced to death for the murder of a woman he'd been living with, Maria Josephina Stephan. Somehow the press didn't get the message that the execution was taking place, and this secrecy added to the outrage after this particular balls-up. The sheriff and some other officials were gathered there as they led Mutter up to the gallows inside the prison. But when the final moment came and the platform was dropped, and I'll warn you, this is fairly gruesome, Mutter's whole head was completely severed from his body. The press, still feeling slighted by their missing invitation, were swift in their condemnation of the whole affair. This appeared in the Telegraph in Brisbane and was reprinted in several other regional papers around Queensland. The executioner attributed this horrible result to the hard condition of the rope caused by the frost. We are informed that the rope was of the usual length and that Mutter was by no means a heavy man. We cannot vouch for the correctness of the details of the execution, and which we have only been able to gather piecemeal from the officials responsible for this piece of barbarity. Not the slightest indication was given to the press that the execution was about to take place. This is an omission on the part of the authorities which deserves the severest reprobation. It continues giving the prison a serving for not informing them about the execution before finally saying this: "The hole and corner fashion in which the convict Mutter was condemned to death this morning is most repugnant to public feelings, and no time should be lost in instituting an inquiry into the conduct of those who are responsible for thus excluding the recognised representatives of the public from a ceremony which, of all others, demands their presence." Interestingly, this botched death sentence did start a dialogue about abolishing capital punishment. The next day, the Telegraph followed up their initial report with a long opinion piece about capital punishment and said this: "The tendency of the public to regard the death sentence with aversion is likely to be strengthened to a degree necessitating the abolition of the punishment if it is carried out in the hurried, secret, brutal manner indicated by our brief account of the awful deed of yesterday." But, as media outlets are wont to do, the Australian disagreed with its rival newspaper. Instead, it simply blamed the executioner. This is what it said: "The execution over and the culprit declared dead, the black flag is hoisted and the public know that justice has taken its course. The inquiry held ought to convince the public, as no doubt it has done, that every precaution was taken to act as humanely as possible, and all are agreed that death must have been instantaneous. We must observe, however, in connection with this melancholy affair, that the conduct of the executioner was brutal, ruffianly, and unfeeling in the extreme towards Mutter before the execution took place, and he has given sufficient evidence of his unfitness for the post which he now holds." Obviously, my favourite line from that report is where it says, "All are agreed that death must have been instantaneous. He was decapitated." Yeah, I'd say that's right. Well, folks, that is our 6 execution fails, done and dusted. There are plenty more. I've held a few back to add to my growing list for future episodes. And don't forget, you can also contact me with any ideas you have for episodes, maybe an amazing story from your own ancestry, or maybe just something you've come across while doing your own family history research. Just pop to the website ratbagsandroustabouts.com and fill out the contact form. While you're there, you can also look at the show notes, as I've said before, and you can read an extra little yarn that I'm going to add there about the longest-serving hangman of the British Empire, Solomon Blay. He hanged more than 200 people over the course of his 50-year career in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. On the website, you can also listen to all the episodes and even read up a little bit about me if you are so inclined to do so. And don't forget to follow Ratbags over on Instagram as well. And as usual, I'll be back in a fortnight's time with the next episode of Rat Bags and Roustabouts. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to follow the show and make sure you join me again for more stories about those common as muck ratbags and roustabouts from our past who still have extraordinary tales to tell.